Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon to you all. So I have a difficult task of giving you a very brief overview on French economic diplomacy in Africa on the day after a very interesting week, because as we know, there was the Franco-African summit in Paris. This French diplomacy in Africa, it bases itself on a strong, wealthy, historic information. There is a close cultural and human link. There is, of course, a French language speaking. There are 500 million French speakers worldwide and 220 from Africa, 770 million French speakers in France. This is something that's impressive for the development of trade. In the Dakar summit a few weeks ago, we saw an increase of 65% in exchanges because there was this sharing of language. There's a very important French community in Africa, 142,000 French people in sub-Saharan Africa, 107,000 in North Africa. There's an important African diaspora in France as well. France is the first country to welcome foreign African students, 100,000 students, and there are more than 400 partnerships between French local territorial authorities and African ones. So the political and economic links are powerful. Are strong, rather. In Africa, there are many partnerships, companies that have been there for a long time. So, there is more than 1,000 French companies in Africa. There is the power of the African markets, which is recognized in France. And when we purchased the CFAO a few years ago, it's because we were very close, and that's why we wanted to purchase CFAO. The investments for French investments in Africa are 26.3 billion euro, and we're one of the main investors in the African continent. French companies are the first employers in several countries, about 80,000 employees in Cameroon, for French companies, 25,000 in Angolan French companies. And Africa is a priority for the official development aid. 3.5 billion were committed in 2014, and half of the French Development Agency managers and employees are positioned in Africa. This is a political decision, and France has always positioned itself ceaselessly for peace and security in Africa, as you've probably seen after the actions in Mali and Central African Republic recently. So, when it comes to economic diplomacy, it started with the Elysian summit. It was said again in the Franco-African summit last week. We want economic partnership and shared growth. Africa has indeed got huge potential, and it has huge needs to be met. There's a dynamic for economic growth, which is about 5% per year on average, and in the next 10 years, it's going to go on like that. That's what, in line with what we can expect from emerging countries, which is between 5 and 6%, but the expected growth in Europe is 1.5% in Europe. So you can see why this African growth can be attractive for European countries and France especially. There's a demographic growth that supports this economic growth. In 2050, there'll be 2 billion inhabitants in Africa and 1.5 billion in an urban environment. So this is a leap. As we said last week in Bercy, it's a leap, an historic leap. We're going to go from 1.5 billion urban inhabitants to many more inhabitants in just 20 to 30 years. And there are many considerable issues. There are needs in infrastructures, $85 billion per year. That's the APAD's estimate. There are crucial needs in various sectors: urbanization, developing towns, huge cities like Kinshasa. Kinshasa may, in the future, be the most popular city in Africa. Energies, renewable energies, water, sanitation, development, school, technology, and information. All these areas are areas where French companies have undeniable assets. We have know-how, we have expertise, we are involved in various sectors, and in the African market is a wonderful place to invest for SMEs and larger-sized companies in France. But over the past 10 years, France has seen its position gradually erode away. It's not so much erosion of volume, more in market share. This erosion is actually quite significant. Exports to sub-Saharan Africa are worth 12 billion euro. They've increased from 2002 to 2012, but the market share has gone from 11.8% for France to 5.9%. Exports to North Africa are 15 billion euro. And in sub-Saharan Africa and Northern Africa, we are faced with more and more challenges. The Spaniards in Morocco, Chinese and Indians in sub-Saharan Africa. So, what are the priorities of economic diplomacy in Africa? There are several objectives: pushing export and developing trade. In the Élysée summit, the French president talked about doubling our trade with Africa over the next 5 years. We want to increase the number of companies that export nowadays. There are 120 companies who are exporting from France to Africa. We want to go to 500,000 by 2017. It's also supporting the international development of companies in Africa. So just a few things I'd really like to mention now, things we'd like to focus on. First of all, what are we going to prioritize our exports on? There's this will of a government and on the trade, the Minister for Foreign Trade. We want to federate families where we have advantages, where we have assets, which meet worldwide needs: agriculture, sustainable cities, communications, health, tourism. We'll create a new family working on renewable energies, and the objective is to federate the French offer and to be able to work on a horizontality of offer. When you're talking about sustainable cities, you must be capable of setting up urban installations. You've got to have companies which can work in various sectors, and that's something on which the federators for sustainable cities are mobilized. And when you talk about developing offer, you've also got to develop supply verticality. So upstream, training, supplying the good, management and maintenance. It's only if you can work on all of supply that you can be competitive. If you're just working on supplying one good, it's a lot more difficult to be competitive if you compare yourself with other actors, like, for example, the Chinese. Another area is to encourage corporate social responsibility. That is something that governments in African countries are asking for more and more. They want growth that's both sustainable and inclusive. This is something that the head of state of Mozambique has said when he came to Quai d'Orsay, the vice minister of Ethiopia as well. This is a message which must be heard, and French companies are known for doing that. We must value French positions as a hub for investments in Africa, just like Morocco is trying to value its positioning as a hub for investment in sub-Saharan Africa. France is trying to do the same with international investors. We want to develop approaches in terms of co-localization. The most striking example is Renault in Tangier, but there are others. Valuing the positioning in the value chains, industrial installations, both in France and abroad, which will allow us to be more competitive when it comes to sharing value. Favoring the emergence of new models is also important to serve mass markets with purchasing power conditions which aren't quite the same as in Europe. These are models in which we encourage our companies to position themselves. Many companies like Danone are working on this. Danone, L'Oréal. These are essential issues, especially when it comes to consumer goods. And finally, to give you a more global view, we want an approach that's the approach of a global partner towards Africa as a whole, not just French-speaking Africa. So what's at stake for France is both Portuguese-speaking, French, English-speaking Africa, and French-speaking Africa. That's what we're aiming for. Now, what we've done with Mozambique, the discussions with Mozambique and Angola are well within this. And Laurent Fabius in South Africa, with a signature with a huge contract with Alstom, or Laurent Fabius in Angola, there's a sort of approach which are really interesting, but they're forgetting the importance of Portuguese-speaking Africa and English-speaking Africa. There's an organization of the means of a state. The means of the wherewithal of a state was talked about by our head of state in the French African Summit. We want to double the AFD's funds, moving official development aid up to 5 billion euros, 20 billion euros in the next 5 years. We also want to invest more money in Africa. We already had invested 2 billion in Africa, 1 billion in ICTs and emerging countries and further study tools, which are more directly linked to sub-Saharan Africa. This is something that the President talked about last week, an export credit mechanism, which is more important than 7,200 million euro, 700 euro. And we're also going to take part in the green funds with the adaptation to climate change, which is essential for several countries. This is also a sustained effort in vocational training and human capital. That's what's at stake with our shared growth. There are several programs which are underway. The Young Leaders, the Lead Campus program, the HR Excellence program with the Siam companies. Several initiatives were launched, like by groups like Atos in Dakar, which is going to train 1,000 engineers, infrastructures, and training in human capital are subjects which are often discussed with African leaders. We'd also like to remind you support to entrepreneurships, what's been talked about with the Center for Young Leaders, the university establishments, university studies in France, and just to complete this, the cooperation in public-private partnerships, legal frameworks, for example, and things that can support for funding of major infrastructure projects. This also means that you need to adjust the means of agencies, operators' means, and state services means. Africa is in the strategy of a new operator of business for France that regroups both the activity of a French agency for international investments and the agency of UB France. And in all these aspects, the attractivity, you have several sovereign funds in Africa that must be attracted to be able to offer solutions for diversification of investment, exports, working with our SMEs and ETIs in the African market. That's going to lead to the opening of a new BeFrance office in Nigeria, because there's a huge market in Nigeria, 70 million inhabitants, which can't be ignored. That's how we're going to work with our SMEs and ETIs on this market. Support to SMEs and ETIs is essential. We've got resources in Ethiopia, Mozambique, Ghana, Senegal, Congo, Brazzaville. There's the reopening of some economic services. We've done that in Mozambique, in Mali, Ghana. And Africa is within the strategy of various investors. They're going to open an office in Nairobi, and they've committed themselves on all sorts of actions, funds, Averroes 1, 2, and 3. Averroes 3 was closed at the beginning of this year. It was opened at the beginning of the year. It was funded for 17 million euro by Proparco and others. We've got Tunivest, AfricaVest. We'll do that next. That'll happen next week. There's a Caisse des Dépôts that works on Inframed. We've got an African fund as well, which we're setting up currently. Another thing I'd like to talk about with you is this approach on co-investment or co-funding with third countries in Africa. This is essential. As the French president said last Friday, France is often asked for help. France is perceived as being a good partner for the development of operations in Africa. We got Japan went to us for that. South Africa as well. They're asking France to open up the market of French-speaking Africa, opening in exchange for opening to English-speaking Africa, Turkey as well. When François Hollande went to Turkey, there was this will to create partnerships in Northern Africa, with a division of tasks. That was one possibility for Gulf countries. Take, for example, Kuwait of United Arab Emirates, both through investments and development funds who think that the opportunity of investing with the French in sub-Saharan Africa. The latest person to turn for us was China. This was talked about when the French Prime Minister went to China a few weeks ago. China wants to develop joint operations in Africa with France. We'll see how we can follow up on this request and in what kind of projects we can work. So there are two things at stake. There's first of all funding, because there are problems with funding in these infrastructural projects, and another issue, which is industrial partnerships. So the partner coming in to complete the offer, and he's going to contribute to making it more competitive. So Africa is a priority of French economic diplomacy. Africa's our past and is going to contribute in part to our future. The Nigerian finance secretary said he wanted to encourage the French to not miss the train of Africa, and I hope I've managed to convince you that we're not going to miss that train. Thank you very much, Vincent.
Now we have some time for a couple of questions, plus my question. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, or International Development rather, is the state, in fact, and together we share a growing interest of the French state towards Africa, but we all know very well that states are poor companies are rich. That's the reason why our system was created. And therefore, how can the state encourage investors in companies to go and invest in Africa, acting as brokers between investment funds and institutional investors? I mean, when we meet with corporate players in Paris or in other regions, we often hear, well, it's too risky. It's an epiphenomenon. Nothing will happen there. And still, we feel that entrepreneurs and French investors are not convinced. So, what about the role of your department in this? How can you convince these people? And in 2 years' time, if Mr. Fabius were not working as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, if Mr. Hollande was not President of the French Republic any longer, would this action you started continue, and how? Because starting an action, announcing it in the middle of the term of reference, in the middle of the political mandate, we may end up in a situation where there were great hopes, but that are finally disappointed. So perhaps you would like to answer now. I will answer immediately. But just a few comments, if I may. In order to mobilize all the effort, it's one of the roles of Business France and BPI. Nicolas Dufour spoke this week at the Club des Entrepreneurs, saying that today the only way to guarantee competitiveness for French SMEs is innovation and export. Export for SMEs and mid-sized companies towards the African continent clearly is an opportunity to seize that we need to further encourage. So there's a link between BPI and Business France. This is about support. Now, funds, except for public expenditures, mentioned by our president, which of course are limited resources, we have to come up with new ideas with these three-part partnerships, looking at for capitals that could fund, equity in order to fund fund projects in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's why the Caisse des Dépôts is working on currently, of course, together with the different Gulf funds. And then what will work in what will happen in 2017? I think that Africa will remain a priority, because it is not possible to ignore the great dynamics of this continent and what it can trigger in terms of growth and economic development to our company. So it remains a priority for the French economic diplomacy. But will the diplomacy be the same as the one Laurent Fabius desired to design? Well, it will depend on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to be. But the experience of Laurent Fabius implies that somebody quite experienced will have to take over. So just like for companies, the question is governance. Men are the pillar of this improvement. Could you please introduce yourself? Abatouré, Business Africa Economic Magazine Director. You've designed the historic link between France and Africa. You've also talked about the importance of the stock of investments by France. And you rightly said about the wonderful tool, which is the French-speaking players. You've talked about France's involvement in the crisis in Mali and Central Africa. I'm wondering, do you think these tools, instruments, and all ties are not, in the end, insufficient in order to face and challenge the arrival of India, China, and Brazil, which are much more pragmatic countries who are not taking care about specific geopolitical considerations? Should we come up with other things, other ideas to boost France's competitiveness on the African market? Second question, if you agree, and then we'll have time for answers. And then we can move on to the next panel. Could you please stand up and introduce yourself? I come from Guinea-Bissau, and I'm developing an urban development project, an infrastructure project. I'd like to know, how can we come to you so that you can support us? Because we've been trying to develop that project for quite a while, but nothing's moving on, really. Thank you, sir. Well, we'll listen to your answers now. First question. I split my presentation in two parts, in fact, and I've identified, first of all, the strong ties between our countries and continents, and perhaps the avenues we need to further explore to live up to our challenges, which are China, India, as you said, Brazil now, and even Spain to a certain extent, and Morocco. So I try to list a certain number of avenues that would help us consolidate and intensify this bilateral relationship between France and Africa. Regarding the project in Guinea-Bissau, and I have not informed of all the details, we could work as a broker to connect people, because we're not fully implementing this project. We're like working on passive intermediation. So depending on the project and on it and how well received it is by some industrial partners, we can see how we can help you. Financial support. Well, financial support. We'll have a closing speech by Mrs. BBR from BPR France, so perhaps she will be able to answer your questions. Otherwise, during the cocktail party, you'll have a chance to raise your question. It's just one thing. It's about projects and infrastructure in projects, so we have to find the right mix between the different funding schemes of different sources, AFD, amongst others. So each project must be specifically studied. We're now working on railway projects in Côte d'Ivoire or Senegal. So we're trying to see how we can work on the funding equations of these projects. And so from the moment we are involved, there are, of course, French operators.